Cheng Hai stands with a bloody sword over the body of the salesman and, turning to Liao Liao with a serious face splattered with blood, says that the weak one is finished. Liao Liao angrily shouted at the main character that he was taking a lot on himself. Cheng Hai grinned viciously at him and asked if he thought it was all an empty truth and if he was thinking of taking revenge on him. Liao Liao furiously shouted at him to be quiet and took out a green-bladed poison dagger. Above his head you can see a yellow window with the title, "Run, Cowards." The dialogue box describes the title effect, Speed +2, with the participation of a teammate, Strength +2, Speed +2. Cheng Hai, with the red title Lone Wolf on his head, twirled his sword playfully in his hand as he stood in front of Liao Liao, who had taken a fighting stance. The leader was sitting on the floor with his back against the concrete wall. Cheng Hai touched his face with his index finger and mockingly told Liao Liao that he was very scary. They instantly disappeared from their seats. Their movements were so fast that one could only see the sparks from their weapon strikes that flashed all over the place, leaving a white trail behind them. Looking at these sparks, the leader thought that he had seen a lot, but the fight between these two exceeded all his knowledge of level 5 adventurers. He closed his lips tightly and opened one eye, thinking that he was afraid that even among level 7-8 adventurers, there weren't many who possessed this kind of speed. He understood why people wonder if every adventurer can become a legend, since many don't even make it to the 5th level. Liao Liao was thrown sideways by the impact, his back hitting a concrete pillar, and blood spurted out of his mouth. He fell to the floor with his hands on the ground and cursed that even with the title, he couldn't match Cheng Hai's speed and that it was annoying. The main character stares at him motionlessly, holding a bloody sword in one hand. Liao Liao wiped the blood on his face with the sleeve of the hand holding the green-bladed dagger and clarified that the main character's perception was at least 17-18. Cheng Hai smiled smugly as he pointed the sword forward and asked if he understood. Liao Liao gritted his teeth in anger and shouted for the adventurer panel. An interface appeared in front of him and he stuck his hand in. The main character mockingly asked if Tom didn't have enough speed. Liao Liao took out a glass jar with a green liquid inside, and while glaring at the protagonist furiously, he replied that it wasn't enough. Liao Liao threw the jar to the floor, the jar broke, and Liao Liao was surrounded by green gas. The main character looked surprised. Liao Liao raised his hand, surrounded by green gas, the veins on his body bulged and turned green, his eye glowed green, and a purple title could be seen above his head, a toxin transporter. He said that he didn't plan to use it on Cheng Hai, but Cheng Hai left him no choice. Leaving a trail of green gas behind, Liao Liao charged at the protagonist, and the protagonist blocked the dagger with his sword while gritting his teeth. Liao Liao, with a mad smile, told him to taste the mutant spider toxin that he had purchased on the black market. Cheng Hai noticed the green gas surrounding him. The veins on one side of his face and neck bulged, turning green, red capillaries showing in his eye, and he gritted his teeth. Cheng Hai crossed his arms in a block as Liao Liao threw many quick dagger strikes at him, slashing all over his body with blood spurting out. Smiling madly, Liao Liao noted that the main character's poison resistance was worse than ordinary people's. As he continued to stab with the dagger, he asked him about how he didn't even have the strength to fight back. The main character, still blocking with his hands, silently gritted his teeth. His eye was green with poison. Cheng Hai swung his sword sharply, but Liao Liao arched his torso backwards and jumped back with a few somersaults. Touching his hand to the floor, he grinned and said that it was too slow and didn't even touch him. Standing in a fighting stance, covered in cuts and green swollen veins on his arm and face, the protagonist asked Liao Liao about the spider venom being something he had prepared for them. Flexing his fists, he replied that he got it after leaving the 7th level Spider's Den dungeon, and explained that this poison significantly reduces strength, speed, and stamina. Smiling wickedly, Liao Liao held up 5 fingers and said that thanks to him, he was able to get rid of 4 level 5 adventurers, and that Cheng Hai would be the 5th. The main character, looking seriously at his opponent, replied with a smirk that he should have prepared more poison and told him to show what he was capable of. Liao Liao stopped smiling and glared at the protagonist in disbelief. Cheng Hai smiled confidently and continued to provoke him, asking if this was all he had. The latter, looking at him seriously, replied that this was not all. He shouted, grinning madly as he pointed the bloody dagger towards Cheng Hai, saying that since he holds the title of a toxin carrier, everything, including his breath, the sweat on his skin, and the blood that flows in his veins, is all poison. He said that the longer it was around him, the deeper its venom would get into him, and he would wait for the venom to clear and he would bleed all over. Looking at Liao Liao, the leader thought that this was a very creepy tactic, and even Liang, being a martial arts expert, wouldn't be able to beat him. He was thinking that if he couldn't finish the battle before the poison was absorbed, then it would be much harder to do so later. He added that his level is not lower than the 6th, and here it remains only to fight. Gritting his teeth and holding his hand on his shoulder, the leader remarked that it was no wonder that Liao and his companions treated them like trash, since with this title, you can defeat anyone. Shanghai said that he realized that the title escaped death was visible above his head, and he called up the adventurer panel, much to Liao's surprise. He pressed a few buttons on the panel, saying that he also wanted to look at something. 5 blue dialogue boxes appeared in front of him and said, thanks to the skill 1 step 1 kill, the adventurer gets the opportunity to calculate the next step of the enemy. Death Evader effect activated strength, agility, perception +4. Key features improved. Poisoning. The poison will weaken the adventurer's stats to varying degrees. The professional skill dancing with death triples poison damage. Shanghai calmly said to turn off the dance with death skill. The panel announced that the poison damage was removed, and the dance with death is normal. Liao was surprised to find that the main character had disappeared right before his eyes. Shanghai appeared right in front of Liao, striking out with his sword, and Liao had a hard time blocking his dagger strike, caught off guard. Gritting his teeth, Liao said that it was impossible and asked how he had achieved such speed. Shanghai smiled ominously and asked if he understood. The main character instantly appeared behind Liao and slashed his back with his sword, causing him to cry out. He turned around angrily, brandishing his dagger, and shouted at him not to be conceited. Liao quickly stabbed the dagger in front of him, but there was no one there. Shanghai was behind him and said with a serious face that he was too slow to reach him that way. Liao gritted his teeth in rage, shouting that it was impossible because Shanghai was a normal lone wolf, and asking how he could be stronger than Liao if he had defeated a bunch of level 5 adventurers. The protagonist pierced Liao's chest from behind with his sword, and blood gushed out from his wound. Liao screamed in pain. Shanghai put his face close to Liao's ear and told him that nothing was impossible, and that he, wrapped in comfort, would never see the scenery that one who walks on the edge between life and death sees. To the protagonist's surprise, Liao grabbed the sword blade protruding from his chest with his hand. He turned to face the main character and said with a serious face that often those who can swim will still drown, and he won't get very far if he doesn't change his strategy. He explained that only by hunting those weaker than him would he be able to accumulate strength to compete with level 10 adventurers. Liao concluded that his path was the right one. Shanghai told him with a serious face that it might work for ordinary people, but for those who had already been on the edge, death wasn't the only option. He forcefully took out the sword from Liao's chest, and blood gushed out profusely. Liao fell to the ground in a pool of his own blood. The leader thought in surprise that Shanghai had defeated such a strong man. He was surprised when the main character turned in his direction. Shanghai smiled slightly and put his index finger to his lips, telling him to be quiet. Yingxiao Hospital. The main character is lying in a hospital bed, looking at the phone. A blue title is visible above his head. Zhu Mao entered the room, telling him that he was a lucky guy. The main character sat up in bed, asking why he was here. Zhu Mao explained as he got closer to the protagonist that when he first entered the dungeon, he encountered monsters that were immune to physical attacks, and the exit was blocked by scavenger vultures. Shanghai replied with a smile that he received the title of Death Incarnate. Zhu Mao sat down on the next bunk, crossed his legs, and told him with a smile not to forget that there is misfortune next to luck. He asked the main character how often level 5 adventurers encounter opponents that surpass them in strength. Zhu Mao held up his index finger and advised him not to reveal his title to others, because leaking information is disastrous for an adventurer, and it's not just monsters that adventurers should be wary of in dungeons. Laughing innocuously, Shanghai scratched the back of his head and said that he would remember. Looking at the main character with a smile and a cold look, Zhu Mao reflects that although the owner of the Banshee dungeon was declared dead by other survivors, but he can hardly believe that a person with his fighting skills and level was able to go through all this alone. The smile faded from Zhu Mao's face as he watched the main character press a button on the adventurer panel and remove his title, looking up in surprise. Shanghai turned to him and asked if there was anything on his face. Zhu Mao, getting up from his bunk, said no, and explained that he just remembered that the coach was coming back at the end of the month. As he approached the door of the ward, he told him to remember to return to training when he recovered from his injuries, and that he would soon move on to the next stage. The main character agreed, and Zhu Mao left the ward. Shanghai glanced at the empty cot next to him. He remembers asking the leader, who is lying on a nearby coin, at night that he no longer plans to be an adventurous strategist. The leader, putting his hands behind his head, replied that this trip made him realize that he can't become a legendary adventurer, and in a good way, his limit is level 1-5. He said that he would prefer to save energy and resources by not trying to reach level 6-10 and retire. He opened one eye. The leader looked at the main character and said that he was not like that and he had potential due to his ruthlessness. Shanghai asked with a smile why he was saying that. The leader replied with a smile that although the lone wolf title gave him a lot of privileges, it was all limited to the 10th level of the dungeon, and as for the 11-15 levels, his strength would not be enough. He explained that if he wants to become a legend, he needs to create his own team before he reaches the 10th level, otherwise he will be stuck at level 11-15 or be banned and lose all his opportunities. Cheng Hai lies alone in a hospital room during the day, hands behind his head, and thinks about the team. Coffee house. A hooded girl is sitting at the same table as a man in glasses and a business suit who is pulling something out of his jacket. He put 2 photographs on the table and said that the vultures who had killed his son were dead and their killer was among the survivors. This man is a rich man from Fujian, Cao Hua Wang. He asked her who she thought was the benefactor who had helped avenge his son. She silently glanced at the photos and pointed at Cheng Hai's photo. Morgue, Yingxiao Hospital. Box number 26 is shrouded in blue energy. A blue portal appears on it with a dialogue box that says Dungeon 16, 28, 22. The next day, Cheng Hai, dressed in white hospital clothes, sits on a bench outside. Someone called his name and he turned questioningly. 2 guys in t-shirts with sinister smiles were standing in front of him. The guy with the dark hair told him that he was Cheng Hai, who was in the Banshee Forest. The blonde-haired guy was flexing his fists. The guy with dark hair is a level 5 adventurer from the Bad Fist Brothers Company from Yingxiao. He smiled unpleasantly, said that they were very interested in the items he had received, and asked what he could offer them. Cheng Hai calmly crossed his arms and said that the items were not for sale. The dark-haired guy paled in anger, and the blonde-haired guy laughed, saying that he thought they were on a business proposition. Cheng Hai looked at them intently. A guy with dark hair sat down very close to the main character, putting his arm around his neck, and, smiling maliciously, asked him to rephrase. He told him to give him what he found there. Cheng Hai calmly pulled his head away from the other's face. The guy demanded to do it quickly, threatening that otherwise he would regret it. A nurse wearing round glasses with 2 black pigtails appeared in front of them and shouted at them to get out and don't dare disturb their patients. The dark-haired man stood up and called for his companion to leave. The blonde-haired guy scratched his head in exasperation. They left, and Cheng Hai and the nurse watched them go. The nurse, with a serious face, with her hand on her chest, told the protagonist to tell her right away the next time they bothered him, and explained that her brother was a level 10 adventurer, and they wouldn't go against her. Cheng Hai smiled awkwardly and thanked her. She started shaking his hand and said that she should thank him. Cheng Hai stared back at her in disbelief. Tears welled up behind her round glasses, and she said that her friend had died in that dungeon, and Cheng Hai had dealt with the villains who had killed him, and that she and her friend's family were extremely grateful to him. Cheng Hai replied with a smile, who would have thought it. The dialogue box on the morgue crate showed that the timer had reached 0, and the portal burst with blue energy. The entire hospital building was shrouded in blue energy. The nurse started to say something, but suddenly disappeared into thin air, leaving a blue holographic trail. Cheng Hai opened his mouth in surprise. Jumping up from the bench, he found people disappearing around him and the ground shrouded in blue energy. He shouted that it was a phenomenon of capturing people after a dungeon rampage. He was surprised to find that it had also started to disappear, shrouded in blue squares. He disappeared and found himself sitting on the ground. He rubbed the back of his head, complaining that it hurt. Looking in front of him, he froze in surprise when he saw, along with the other people who were accidentally dragged into the dungeon, a landscape with a head of land covered with tombstones all the way to the horizon. The dialogue box says, Cemetery, Level 5. Current applicants 20 out of 20. Exit conditions, kill 100 skeleton soldiers. Special conditions, survive for an hour. The crowd of people was surrounded by tombstones. The nurse, adjusting her glasses, shouted at them not to panic and explained that they were trapped in an entry-level dungeon. She asked them to open the adventurer panel and confirm the mission. She was hugging a frightened little boy, and people were looking at her with worried expressions. The guy with blue hair and shaved temples and the back of his head is the manager of the Yingxiao Adventurer Association, Judah. He held his cheek, clenching his teeth tightly, and thought about how he had come to treat a tooth and ended up in a dungeon. Cheng Hai tensely said, expand the panel. A dialogue box appeared in front of him, and he noticed in shock that this was a level 5 dungeon and a lot of people might die. A branch of the Yingxiao Adventurers Association. The man asks in surprise that people were dragged into the dungeon at Yingxiao Hospital and 20 people just disappeared. This is Shang Lai, the hiring manager of the Yingxiao Adventurer Association, a level 9 adventurer. He is dressed in a business suit with a red tie and has short black hair. He asks in surprise, saying on the phone that Judah is also with them. A crowd of people surrounds the hospital building, covered with police tapes. Shang Lai enters the hospital grounds with a man and a woman in business suits. He asks a man in a brown suit with a paper in his hand what's going on. He replies that there are 17 civilians and 3 adventurers on the missing persons list. He said that they had found the entrance to the dungeon, and said, but Shang Lai tensely asked him what he meant. People in the dungeon discuss what their missions are by looking at the adventurers' panels. They agreed that they all had the same mission to kill 10 skeletons and hold out for an hour. Bad Fist Brothers is also here. The guy with the blonde hair, addressing the guy with the dark hair, says that the difficulty of their mission is different from the others and notes that Shanghai was also drawn here. He replied that it was logical, explaining that the difficulty of the mission is based on the strength of the adventurer. He gave Shanghai a cold look and said that he needed to find him after they dealt with everything else, and that there were too many people here right now to just get close to him. The blonde-haired guy agreed. Shanghai raises his hand and shouts to the people around him to listen. Shanghai put his foot on a rock and while holding a sword stuck in the ground in his other hand, shouted about how this dungeon was extremely dangerous, and told the others to pick up the weapons they saw on the ground, break up into groups of 3-5 people, and try to complete their exit missions as soon as possible. A guy with a shaved head with a smile asked the main character who he was, that he was giving orders here. The beefy guy in the blue shirt grinned and said that he thought he was doing this to steal their resources, the treasures of the dungeon. Due to the influence of adventurers who have become media personalities, many people think that there are hidden treasures in the dungeons, with which you can get rich and live comfortably for the rest of your days. The main character shouted in shock that this dungeon was really extremely dangerous. He was thinking that the two of them must have gone mad and were arguing with him without knowing anything about the dangers of the dungeon. The nurse pointed her index finger at Shanghai and shouted that he was quite a strong adventurer who had escaped from a very dangerous dungeon a few days ago. She explained that he had teamed up with other adventurers to deal with the people who were forcing newcomers into the dungeons and taking their resources. A voice in the crowd asked if this was true. A female voice said that she had actually seen the news about this case. Another voice explained that it happened at an abandoned construction site, where 2 people used the dungeon entrance found there to kill people and appropriate their resources, and that according to rumors, they killed dozens of people. The nurse pointed at the main character with both hands and asked him to trust her. Shanghai thought that even though it wasn't entirely true, it would be enough to attract attention. Judah asked if this dungeon is really as dangerous as Shanghai says it is. He really thinks that ordinary people like them will be able to complete the quest and get out. He added that killing skeletons is very difficult, and that if everyone listens to him and breaks up into groups, then everything will end up with the younger ones joining together, and the old ones and those who are weaker will be left out of business. He asked if he was even thinking about what would happen to them. One voice in the crowd remarked that a dozen skeletons were not easy to deal with. Another agreed that it would be very difficult to deal with such a large number. Another voice asked if it would be safer to work together rather than split up. Another voice said that he had studied dungeon strategies online, and that other adventurers were saying that ordinary people should stick together at the dungeon entrance or stay where they are and wait for help. Another voice agreed and said that a lot of people died because they were wandering around the dungeon alone. Judah chuckled viciously, thinking that his brother-in-law was right to hire him to incite fools like these, and that he could only rely on a tongue-in-cheek attitude to get the experienced adventurers to protect him. He looks at the main character with a grin, thinking that if he thinks for a moment about the lives of all these people, he will immediately turn into their nanny. Shanghai exhaled and turned to the nurse and the little boy next to her, asking if they believed him. They nodded back. He turned and went, calling them to come with him, and said that he could let them pass the mission. The nurse agreed and ran after him, holding the little boy's hand. Judah furiously asked who allowed him to leave. The main character stopped without turning back. Judah, with a smug smile, loudly said that as the only adventurer present with experience in such dungeons, he should stay and protect them. People shouted to him that with great power comes great responsibility, and that he must fulfill their missions as well. Shanghai calmly replied that he wasn't officially an adventurer, so he didn't have any responsibility for their safety. The nurse and Judah were surprised. Judah looked at him questioningly, tensing up. The main character turned to him with a threatening face, his eyes burning red, and said that there was no need to appeal to his moral principles, and that he would break his leg without hesitation and leave him here to fight for his life. Judah fell to the ground in shock. People shouted after Shanghai, and the nurse with the little boy left, asking why he was acting like this. And shouldn't people protect those who are weaker? Another voice in the crowd shouted that he probably didn't become an official adventurer because of his low morale. One of the people in the crowd turned around and noticed the Bad Fist brothers leaving and asked where they were going. The dark-haired guy replied that they thought he was right, and that since one of the exit rules was survival for 1 hour, they would have a hard time. And for ordinary people, the right thing to do would be to complete their missions and get out of here as soon as possible. Turning away, the guy chuckled, thinking about who would agree to be someone's bodyguard for the sake of some kind of morality, adding that they were not fools. At the same time, Shanghai and a few people are standing in front of the door in the hospital building, which gave off a strong blue energy. Shanghai stared at her, his teeth clenched in surprise. The girl behind him, shielding her hand from the bright light, asked what was wrong with this dungeon. Gritting his teeth, Shanghai replied that the question wasn't what was wrong with him, but how many people would still be alive after that hour. The blue dialogue box shows a countdown that showed 53 minutes and 14 seconds, and a survivor counter that showed 20 out of 20. The blow severed the skeleton's skull. The dialogue box says, exit mission progress, 1 out of 100, remaining time, 50 minutes 36 seconds. Shanghai stands with the sword that he just used to chop off the skeleton's head. Behind him is a nurse with a baby. He handed her the sword and told her to just repeat after him. He explained that she needed to use this sword to cut open the skeleton's neck when it started crawling out of the grave. The nurse opened her mouth in surprise and took the sword from his hand. She asked, "And you?" She was surprised to find 3 skeletons crawling out of the ground. Shanghai looked at them calmly. He opened the adventurer's panel, and an axe appeared in his hand. He said he'd look into it. The light guy from Bad Fist Brothers, grinning, smashed the skeleton with a punch. The dark-haired boy yawned, covering his mouth with his hand, while his companion happily beat up the skeletons. With an expressionless face, he told the blonde-haired guy to remember to switch with him when he was done with this game. He agreed. Shanghai cut the skeleton in half with an axe strike along its spine. Around the main character, there were piles of skeletal bones on the ground. Shanghai wiped the sweat from his forehead with his hand, and a purple dialogue box with the title Undead Slayer can be seen above his head. Title effect, Charisma -2, Damage +2. He thought about how the skeletons had stopped appearing, and it didn't seem like there were an infinite number of them in this cemetery. The good news is that the pressure on novice adventurers at this location is not so great. The bad news is that adventurers with experience have a much harder task. Shanghai turned to the nurse and the boy, who were holding swords in their hands, and said that they had destroyed all the skeletons, and that they could move on. The nurse agreed. People are fighting with skeletons around Jowda, who was just standing there with a sword. Looking around tensely, he shouted for the wounded to retreat, while the others split up into pairs and take turns killing the skeletons crawling out of the ground. He added that they had only 40 minutes to hold out and they would be free. The crowd agreed. 10 minutes later, the ground of the cemetery is littered with the bones of fallen skeletons. A guy in a white t-shirt, holding a sword in his hand, stretches his arms and says that, fortunately, the job of an adventurer was not as difficult as he thought. The guy in the purple shirt scratched his head and said that these skeletons weren't as scary as that guy said. Chowda gritted his teeth in anger as he cursed at these two guys, thinking that just because these skeletons were weak didn't mean that the difficulty of the dungeon was low. On the contrary, if the skeletons weren't strong enough, it was an indicator that there was someone more terrifying in the dungeon that could increase the difficulty of the dungeon. Dungeon level up to the highest entry level value, level 5. Looking at the adventurer's panel dialogue, he thought that the resources were far less than he had expected, even though he had managed to persuade the adventurers to help. Or rather, he had used the old men and the weaker ones to force the adventurers to help. He had only killed 4 skeletons out of the 10 required. He started chewing on his thumbnail nervously and thought that it was fine if he could finish 10 minutes before the end of time. But if not, there would definitely be more skeletons here, and he had to find a way to kill the remaining 6 skeletons as soon as possible. The dialogue box shows that there are 35 minutes and 43 seconds left. The main character took out the axe point from the skeleton's skull. After exhaling and placing the axe on his shoulder, Shanghai asked the nurse if their missions were completed. The boy, smiling happily, answered in the affirmative. He glanced at the nurse and asked her how much she had left. She opened her mouth nervously and, awkwardly touching her index finger to her cheek and smiling, replied that it was 8. He assumed that she had been helping the boy all along. Putting his hand in his pocket, he told the boy to come back while they continued cleaning up the skeletons. He offered to meet them outside when they were done. The boy agreed. Blue energy radiated from behind the double hospital doors. Shanghai shouted that in 10 years, no one had been able to pass this dungeon on their own. He gritted his teeth and said that the dungeon was very large, as well as the number of people who were drawn there, and that almost everyone there was a novice. The girl next to him was looking at him in surprise. She worriedly asked where such an abnormal dungeon came from, and shouldn't the difficulty be related to the strength and experience of adventurers? Shanghai stiffly replied that it was all about one mechanism of this dungeon, the grave of an experienced fighter. He explained that the mission difficulty for newbies is only 1/10 that of experienced adventurers, and when newbies complete their tasks and exit the dungeon boss appears, whose strength greatly exceeds the limit that adventurers can handle, and opens a hunt for them, killing most of the experienced adventurers. A large man with long blonde hair is standing in a dark armor with spikes. Shanghai thought that the essence of this dungeon was that once the first contestant left the dungeon, a real race for survival would begin. The boy confirms in the dialogue box that he wants to leave the dungeon. He waved to the main character and the nurse and said goodbye to them. They returned the greeting with a smile. The boy disappeared, leaving a trail of blue squares. Cheng Hai turned to the nurse and said that he would kill a couple of skeletons for her and said that they would meet outside once they completed her mission. The nurse agreed. The portal in the hospital begins to glow, and those present notice that someone has completed a mission. A small boy comes out of the portal, which shocks Shang Lai and the guy with the girl behind him. The blue dialogue box says, Adventurer 20 has left the graveyard dungeon. The second stage begins. Looking at the dialogue boxes in front of them, people in the crowd are surprised that someone has already left, express envy and ask what the second stage is. Youngda stares at the dialogue box in surprise, thinking that the essence of this dungeon is a race for survival, and what will happen now. He called out to the guys in the white t-shirt and purple shirt like Lu Meng and Wang Jiahe and told them to follow him. They looked back at him questioningly. The blonde guy from Bad Fist Brothers told his companion that someone had already completed a mission and left the dungeon, and asked him if he thought it was Cheng Hai Lai. The dark-haired guy said it was impossible because he was wearing a nurse and a baby, and it wasn't easy to find 100 skeletons. The blonde-haired guy scratched his head, asking who it was. The dark-haired boy turned in surprise and saw a silhouette on the cliff. On the cliff was a knight in dark spiked armor, sitting on a ghostly blue horse clad in similarly spiked armor. This is the Death Knight Claude with an unknown difficulty level. Youngda, Lu Min, and Wang Jian walk among the tombstones. The guy in the white t-shirt asked the guy in the purple shirt if it was okay for him to ask them to come with him, but he didn't explain anything. He added that they had traveled quite far, and if they met a large group of skeletons with the three of them, they would be in trouble. He replied that he probably had a reason, and pointed out that he had called them after seeing that the panel had changed. Turning to Youngda's side, he said that he was afraid that he knew more about what was going on in the dungeon than they did. They found that Youngda had stopped walking. In front of him, a crowd of skeletons crawls out of the ground. Weapons appeared in their hands, and Youngda told them to get ready. A voice in the crowd asks about the fact that the three of them never returned, and another tells him that he doesn't care about them. Another voice said that they shouldn't have refused that adventurer's help. Another said that if he hadn't left, many of them would have already made it out. A hoof stamped in front of the crowd, and they turned at the sound. The guy with the shaved head was horrified to see the severed heads of the Bad Fist brothers. Their heads hung from the belt of Claude, who was sitting on his horse. At the same time, Wang Jiahe stands in a rage, blood gushing out from his severed arm. He curses Juda and Lu Meng, asks what they are doing. Juda and Lu Meng run away while a crowd of skeletons surround Wang Jian. Juda asked Lu Meng how much time he had left as he ran. He opened the adventurer's panel and answered. 3. Juda said that just a little more and they needed to find a smaller skeleton group, and then they would be fine. Lu Meng shouted that something was wrong and the number of survivors was decreasing, and something had happened in the camp. They stopped and looked back, and Juda asked what he was saying. Cheng Hai and the nurse fight off the skeletons with their backs to each other. The nurse asked the main character what the second phase was. Cheng Hai, chopping off the head of the skeleton in front of him, replied that perhaps the difficulty would increase or stronger monsters would appear. He told her not to worry about it and asked if she had completed the mission. She said she was going to take a look while opening the adventurer panel. She opened her mouth in surprise when she saw the dialogue box and shouted to the main character that something had happened and there were 4 of them left, and all the others were dead. Claude stands on a horse with a spear in his hand, surrounded by the bloodied bodies of adventurers. Claude looked towards the horizon and said, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. He charged forward on his horse, announcing that he would go to the left. Juda shouts that the dungeon boss has appeared, and if Lu Meng wants to survive, they must stick together and complete the mission before he finds them. Lu Meng furiously shouted that this was nonsense, asking how they could manage this mission together if they couldn't even manage it together with Wang Zhai. Juda asked if he could understand the human language and shouted that they didn't have much time left to find the skeletons. Claude came into view, galloping towards them. He swung his spear, and they saw him coming. Claude announced that he was now going to move to the right. Juda looked at the spear in fear and begged his mother for help. Claude chopped off its head with a single swipe of his spear. Cheng Hai puts on a suit of armor while sitting on the ground and asks the nurse if she's finished. Almost, she noted. The sword severed the head of the skeleton lying on the ground. The nurse, leaning on the sword with her hand, wipes the sweat from her forehead. She turned to Cheng Hai, who was putting on steel gloves, and happily announced that she had completed the mission. The main character turned to her with a smile and told her to drop the sword and leave. His eyes tightened in surprise. Behind the nurse, who started to say something with a puzzled face, Claude swung his spear at her. Cheng Hai charged forward tensely, yelling at her to duck, a weapon appearing in his hand. Activated professional skill dance with death, strength +4, agility +4. The nurse looked around in surprise at the spear approaching her head. The main character managed to block Claude's blow with a green-bladed dagger before it reached the nurse. Claude stared at him in silence, his eyes completely red. Cheng Hai was surprised to see that his dagger was breaking. The force of the impact sent the protagonist and the nurse flying backwards. The blue dialogue box says, sword strength reduced to 0. Cheng Hai landed and looked in the direction of Claude approaching him. He noted its power as he stood in the clearing cloud of dust. A red dialogue box appeared, warning that the adventurer had encountered a dungeon boss. 5 more red dialogue boxes appeared in front of him, stating that the title Deathwalker had been activated. Perception increased to 18, and the hidden skill 1 step, 1 kill had been activated. Title awakened after death, dexterity, strength and perception +4. The adventurer will have a chance to strike before his powers are completely exhausted. The blue dialogue box says, good luck, adventurer. Gritting his teeth, Cheng Hai asked the nurse if she had heard him and told her to leave immediately. She shouted that she understood and that she would be waiting for him outside and he had to survive. The nurse disappeared, leaving a trail of blue squares. Cheng Hai took the sword stuck in the ground in his hand, standing in front of Claude. He took up a fighting stance, grabbing the sword with both hands, and said with a grin that it was finally just the two of them, and that he didn't think he would let it down so easily. Claude was looking at him with an unwaveringly serious gaze. The dialogue box says, Challenge Level 5. Number of survivors 1 out of 18. Number of exited 2. Exit conditions: kill 100 skeleton soldiers 63 out of 100. Special conditions: survive for an hour 15 minutes and 7 seconds left. Shang Lai, the girl and man who came with him, and the boy who came out of the dungeon saw a nurse coming out of the portal. The boy called out happily. The girl walked over to the nurse, putting her arm around her and helping her walk, and asked if there were any other survivors there. She said there was. Cheng Hai and Claude exchanged quick weapon strikes, blocking each other's attacks. Claude swung his spear from above, and the protagonist gritted his teeth, cursed and blocked the sword strike in front of his neck. Holding his sword with one hand on the hilt and the other on the blade, he gritted his teeth and thought that he couldn't go on like this, because he was no match for Claude in strength and speed, and even if he could predict Claude's next move, at this rate, he would soon collapse from exhaustion. Cheng Hai watched in disbelief as Claude moved his weapon away from his sword. Claude swung his spear again, and the protagonist gritted his teeth as he realized that the matter was bad, and he could neither dodge his attack nor block them. Claude's spear struck the protagonist's side, and he was sent flying back by the force of the impact. Claude chuckled viciously. He told the main character, who was sitting on the ground, leaning on his sword, that with such a difference in strength, he was only able to hold on for so long thanks to his tricks, and it was amazing. Cheng Hai looked up at him, blood coming out of his nose and mouth. He noticed that the man was talking to him, and decided that this wasn't the time to think about it. The protagonist gritted his teeth, thinking that he needed to think about what he should do. He looked towards Claude, who was approaching at a slow pace, and thought about how he definitely wouldn't let him live. The clock with the pause button showed 5-3. Shang Lai announced with a tense face that it was over. He said to summarize the situation for his colleagues in Jiangsu and report that only 2 of the 17 civilians had survived, and there were no survivors among the 3 adventurers. The boy was holding on to the nurse, who was standing there with a worried expression on her face. She called out to him, asking if it was too early to draw such conclusions, adding that it had only been 5 minutes. The boy agreed with her. Shang Lai stopped them with a hand gesture and said that he understood their feelings, but asked them to remove their rose-colored glasses. He glanced at the dungeon entrance and said that he wasn't sure if a level 9 adventurer would be able to defeat the boss that was in that dungeon, much less alone. He explained that even if he was the best level 5 adventurer, he wouldn't be able to last that long, and that it had been 5 minutes since they got out and he still hadn't shown up. He asked them if they understood what it meant. They imagined Claude piercing the protagonist's body through with his spear. The nurse fell to her knees in shock. She held her head and said it was their fault, because if they hadn't slowed him down, he would have gotten out of there alive long ago. The boy looked at her with concern. Shang Lai looked at them with dislike, thinking that it was their fault, because if Cheng Hai didn't help them, Judah would most likely have left this dungeon forever. He gritted his teeth in anger and clicked his tongue. When he left, he said that he was going to smoke and gave the man and girl in suits a task to take care of these guys. The girl asked what they should do with the dungeon entrance while Shang Lai took a cigarette out of the pack with his teeth. He turned to her with an evil look and replied that when such low-level entrances get out of control, they pull people in, and after everyone who is pulled in dies, the entrance will close for half an hour and then reappear in a random place. He explained that the association's internal training manual clearly spelled out what to do in such cases and told them to deal with the survivors, and the rest would resolve itself. As he left, he said that if they cared so much about it, they could wait for the outcome. The girl agreed. Claude is holding his spear, which has Cheng Hai hanging from it, pierced through the chest. The main character has a broken sword in his hand, and blood is coming out of the wound. Chuckling, Claude tells him that he's good. Cheng Hai said nothing. Claude swung his spear to throw it to the side, and it fell to the ground. Raising the spear to his head with one hand, he said that he was looking forward to it joining him when he turned into a ghost. The spear in Claude's hand was filled with dark purple energy. The spear in his hand turns into a sword, shrouded in purple energy. Turning around, Claude swung his sword in front of him, and a purple portal opened up in front of him. He and his horse entered it. Lying motionless on the ground, Cheng Hai noted that his plan had worked and thought about how his body was valuable to Claude and how he needed to use the gift of death before he returned. The protagonist's eyes begin to close. The blue dialogue box says, "Hint advice to the host to use the gift the dead can't kill me." The following dialogue box reported that death immunity was activated. The wound on Cheng Hai's chest closed up. He is lying on the ground, wrapped in a brilliant pink energy. A dungeon of unknown level, the kingdom of the Lord of Bones. A purple portal appears among the trees and dead trees, and Claude comes out with his horse. He tensed as he saw a dark purple blob of energy flying across the sky towards him. A blue-skinned man in black robes landed in front of him. A guy with white hair, pointy ears with cross-shaped earrings and stitches on his mouth scratched his head and asked Claude why he was here if he was sent to the cemetery. This legendary creature is a harbinger of the night, challenge level 16. He thought about how it was a waste of time, and he thought that he was here at the invitation of the Lord of Bones. Claude put away his sword and said that he had encountered a newbie adventurer, and that making him a mere skeleton would be too wasteful, and he wanted to ask the Overlord for the Black Knight crown to send him to the reserve. Harbinger of Night scratched his head, grinned, and said that if he remembered correctly, access to the graveyard only opens at the 5th level, and previously beginners regardless of title did not get there. He asked if he was confident that he would become a legend. Cheng Hai propped himself up with a hand on his chest and said that it really was too risky, and if Claude hadn't left on his own initiative, even with the extra life, he wouldn't have had a chance. He paid attention to the dialogue boxes and noticed that it says that a special condition is met, and asked why there is no exit window from the dungeon. Frowning, he realized that without completing the skeleton quest, he wouldn't be able to get out. Taking out his sword, the protagonist said to hurry up before Claude realized that he was still alive. Half an hour later, the nurse and the boy look at the entrance to the dungeon, and she shouts that the entrance is not closed, which means that Cheng Hai is still fighting, and he is still alive. The girl in the suit shouted that she would call the boss. Shang Lai is sitting on the stairs and smoking a cigarette. He thinks with a tense face that she died in the dungeon, and her sister will definitely blame the survivors for everything. A girl in a suit called out to him from the stairs above, and he looked at her questioningly. He asked me what the panic was about. The girl shouted that the entrance to the dungeon still hadn't closed, even though the time was long out. Shang Lai opened his mouth in surprise. Cheng Hai stands surrounded by the bones of fallen skeletons. Breathing heavily, he opens the adventurer panel. The dialogue box says, "Hint, relationship resolution. Friendly reminder, some issues need to be resolved separately." The main character says that he wants to try and clicks on the confirmation button. The dialogue box indicates that the calculation is underway. A yellow dialogue box appears in front of it, which says, "Payment completed. Only you at level 4 managed to survive in the hands of a legendary spirit. Even though your gift has played a decisive role in this, it does not detract from your merits in any way. You are on your way to becoming a legend. Received a new title, Wonder Survivor. Received a new title, Battle with Legend. Received a new title, Opportunist. New title gained, Overdose. Undead. Received a hidden skill, Heroic Knight Badge. Obtained a hidden skill, the exclusive Fake Death skill. Received an invitation letter to the Lord of Bones dinner party. Received a rare item upgrade coupon 1. Rare items obtained, Sword, Dread Flute. Obtained an epic miracle item, Knight's Helmet Claude." Rubbing his chin thoughtfully, Cheng Hai notes that the boss name is Claude and he has a legendary level. He thought that if he remembered correctly, creatures of this level were only found in the corresponding dungeons, and wondered where such a boss would come from in the 5th level graveyard. The main character said that Claude was incredibly strong and asked if anyone had passed this dungeon before other than cheaters like him. He pressed the button confirming his desire to leave the dungeon. Shang Lai looked at the dungeon entrance in surprise. The girl pointed at him and asked him to look at it. She asked if this meant that low-level dungeons continued to exist even after there were no survivors left. Shang Lai replied with a tense face that there were two options. First, an adventurer who was involved in the dungeon completed the main task but not the escape task, and second, an improved dungeon. The nurse, hands clasped in front of her, shouted that this was probably the first option. The boy supported her and shouted that this was the first option. Shang Lai replied that it was impossible, because the graveyard had long been defined by the World Adventurer Association as practically impossible to pass, and that he believed that something inside the dungeon itself had somehow affected it, so its characteristics had changed. The nurse and the boy were angry. The entrance to the dungeon began to glow, and the boy happily shouted that someone was coming out. Cheng Hai walked out of the portal with a questioning expression on his face. The nurse happily shouted that it was indeed Cheng Hai. There are tears of joy in her eyes. Chang Hai scratched his head and calmly noted that they were still here. Shang Lai clenched his teeth in rage, thinking about what kind of tricks this was. A nurse with a worried face told the protagonist that they were worried to death about him, and if he didn't manage to get out of the dungeon because of her, she would feel guilty for the rest of her life. Chang Hai scratched his head and replied that it wasn't that bad. Looking at them with a serious face, Shang Lai noticed that he had cleared almost the entire dungeon by himself. Castle of the Lord of Bones. In a wide room, a dark silhouette sits on a throne that stands on a raised platform. Claude is standing in front of him, propped up on one knee. The Lord of Bones noted that it was the first time Claude had decided to meet him since he sent him to the graveyard. The Lord of the Rings turned out to be a skeleton with long white hair, clad in golden armor, a crown, and a red robe. His trial level is unknown, and his eyes glow red in their empty sockets. Meeting room. Shang Lai is sitting next to the association secretary in charge of recording the conversation between the dungeon supervisor and Chang Hai, who cleared the dungeon. Folding his hands in front of him, Shang Lai asks with a smile if Chang Hai knows that he was the first adventurer in the world to clear this dungeon. Chang Hai, who was wearing his usual black t-shirt and glasses, pointed at himself with an awkward smile and asked if he was the person in question. Flipping through the papers, Shang Lai replies that everything is correct, and although the level of the dungeon is not very high, this location is very well known in the circle of adventurers. He said that Chang Hai's achievement surely attracted big finances and an influx of people. Grinning, he added that the government would be interested. Smiling awkwardly and rubbing his cheek with his index finger, Chang Hai clarified that he should apply now. After slamming a stack of papers on the table, Shang Lai replied in the affirmative and said that Chang Hai's performance in the cemetery and Banshee Forest proved that he definitely had potential, and there were no more than 10 such talented newcomers in Fujian province. Shang Lai grinned ominously and said that he, as the person in charge, couldn't let him go. Chang Hai's face twisted nervously. The boy and the nurse are waiting in the hallway. The boy asks, sitting on the floor, why Chang Hai hasn't come out yet, and suggested that they want to deprive him of the reward for completing the dungeon. The nurse looked surprised, jumping to his feet, but asking why then, Shang Lai asked Chang Hai to talk to him alone. The nurse rubbed her chin, looking up, and said it was unlikely. Shang Lai furiously replied that he wasn't that kind of person, and the boy turned around in surprise. Shang Lai put his hand on his belt and raised an eyebrow as he said that he didn't need any loot from the level 5 dungeon. Behind him, Chang Hai smiled awkwardly as he scratched the back of his head. Folding his arms and covering one eye, the boy replied that even if Shang Lai didn't need him, it didn't mean that his relatives didn't need him. Shang Lai gritted his teeth in anger. Chang Hai ruffled the boy's hair and smilingly told him not to talk nonsense and explained that they were delayed because they were discussing him joining the Adventurers Association. The boy frowned and asked him if he really wanted to work for the state. Chang Hai smiled awkwardly and rubbed his cheek with his index finger, suggesting that he had a problem with it. The boy replied that he just thought that a strong man like Chang Hai could provide for himself, and there was no need for him to obey the rules of the association like Wang Zijian. Shang Lai asked who Wang Zijian was. The boy replied irritably that it was the hero of an immortal adventurer, and asked how the latter, being an adventurer, could not know about it. Shang Lai furiously asked what the connection was between who he was in this book. The protagonist awkwardly considered whether he should tell them that he was the author of this book. Burger joint. The main character, a boy and a nurse, are sitting at a table with trays of food. The boy jumps up, asks Chang Hai if he is really the author of The Immortal Adventurer, and shouts that it can't be. Chang Hai smiled smugly and adjusted his glasses, saying that if he didn't believe him, he could show him the original manuscript of Immortal Adventurer too. The boy asked, "Really?" Chang Hai turned his attention to the nurse, who was looking down with a face like she was about to cry. He asked her what had happened. She awkwardly asked if it was possible for him not to join the association. Chang Hai wondered why. She replied worriedly that she once overheard her brother talking to his friends, and it seems that most of the people who joined the association later regretted their decision. Chang Hai asked if her brother had said why. She replied with an even more worried face that she hadn't spoken, but she remembered the expressions on their faces when they discussed it, and that joining the association was their biggest mistake. The main character paused for a moment. He smiled and said he would think about it, thanking her for her concern. The nurse replied that she should be the one to thank. The cup shattered on the floor. A red-haired woman in an expensive coat points her finger at Chang Lai and shouts at him that Chang Hai refused to help her brother, but Chang Lai decided to accept him anyway. Cursing at him, she asked him if he had forgotten exactly how he had managed to get this position. This woman is the daughter of the deceased legendary adventurer Zhu Chang and the wife of Shang Lai. He looked at her with a serious face. Holding a lit cigarette in his hand, he replied that he hadn't forgotten, and that he had invited him to join them for a reason. He explained that the dungeon he had cleared was special, and in a few days, his name would be known to everyone, and if he agreed to accept the offer of their competitors, it would complicate everything. He added that if he signed a contract with them, then she herself knows what will be waiting for him after reaching the 15th level. Enraged, the girl replied that it was too long, even if he had the potential, and that it didn't mean that he would be able to reach level 15 and become a legendary adventurer. Sitting up in his chair, Shang-Lai replied that he understood. He stubbed out his cigarette and said they'd just get rid of him. Apartment, night. In a dark room, a guy with long, disheveled black hair is sitting at a computer. On its screen is a message stating that the sender has valuable information about the cemetery. In the next message, the interlocutor says that the offer will be valid for about 3 days and asks how much they will be willing to pay. The guy raised an eyebrow, looked up thoughtfully, chewed on his fingernail, and asked aloud if the information about this place hadn't been known for a long time. This is the hacker and purveyor of dungeon information, Lao Huang. He wrote a reply message asking for a hint because he wants to find out if he is interested in this information. The man replied that someone had cleaned out the cemetery a couple of hours ago. Shang-Lai, who was sitting at his laptop, calmly turned to Zhu Chang and said that was all. The girl leaned over her laptop, still looking furious, and asked if he was sure. Shang-Lai glanced at the laptop with a smirk and explained that while the reward for completing a level 5 dungeon might be nothing in the eyes of adventurers, for more experienced level 6-10 adventurers who have a constant problem with running out of resources, this information is very valuable. He said that in adventurer circles, it was normal to use the services of such guys to search for information about dungeons, and you just need to leak information about Shanghai on the black market, and adventurers from all the nearby provinces will rush to search for him who will avenge her brother. On the laptop screen, Lao Huang replied that he was willing to exchange the information for other information or for 15 units of gold from the black market. Shang-Lai replied that he would send the necessary information. Sitting in the cinema hall is a level 7 adventurer, Gao Changyun, a wanted-to-rank criminal. He looks into an old push-button phone, which says that the sender has just received information about a novice adventurer who has passed a level 5 dungeon that no one has ever managed to pass before. The message declares a condition of 50%. Gao Changyun smiled crazily. Shanghai is talking on the phone with a cup in his hand. He asks that his personal data will be entered into the official system within 3 days. Shang-Lai smokes on the balcony and asks him if he's from Dongshan, and offers to find him a temporary place to start so that Shanghai doesn't have to wander around for a few days. Shanghai refused, explaining that he would go to Dongshan on business and return here in a couple of days. The nurse looked at him worriedly, and the boy raised an eyebrow. Shanghai smiled slightly with a cigarette in his hands and said that they would see each other in 3 days. He hung up the phone and looked off into the distance with a serious face, adding in his mind, if he's still alive by then. The next day, Dongshan. Shanghai stands in his house with a backpack in his hands, looking at the entrance to the dungeon, which has become noticeably wider. He said that he hadn't seen him for a few days, and asked how he should feel about the dungeon entrance getting bigger. The main character walked up to the dungeon entrance and extended his hand towards it. A bolt of energy pushed his hand away. A red dialogue box appeared, stating that if his level is lower than 6th, then he can't enter the dungeon. Looking at the dialogue box, the main character said that it turns out that the dungeon is now only available for adventurers from the 6th to the 11th levels. He judged that he was currently at level 5, and according to his previous leveling speed, he would need to complete 1-2 more level 5 dungeons to advance to level 6. Shanghai is sitting on the sofa with his legs crossed, flipping through his phone, and says that last time he browsed the forum, he remembered that there is a level 5 dungeon in Dongshan where people are recruited. He said that he was lucky and it is still relevant. On the phone screen, it said, having adventurers from the association to help with the process, no vultures, level 5 dungeon goblin crypt. We recruit thugs and interested private traders. Shanghai typed out a question about what the recruitment conditions were. The person in the chat told him that he needed to have experience clearing level 5 dungeons, have a combat role or command title, and sign a temporary contract. And after leaving the dungeon, according to the amount of the contribution, the payment is 3-to-1 in relation to the price of gold coins on the black market. Zhu Mao, wiping his sweat with a towel in the gym, asks over the phone why Shanghai is asking him about black market gold coins. The main character replied with a smirk that he was looking through the forum and found that when adventurers on the forum trade with each other, they don't use cash, so he was curious about what gold coins they were talking about. Sitting down on a bench and taking out a bottle of water from his bag, Zhu Mao replied that, with the exception of low-level dungeon entrances and various drops, one of the most common currencies to pay for anything is black market gold coins. Shanghai looked up thoughtfully, clutching his chin, and asked what was so special about them and why they couldn't just be paid in cash. Zhu Mao, holding the bottle to his lips, replied that gold coins were quite common in level 10 and higher dungeons, and that he had asked the trainer about it before. He said they were quite useful in high-level dungeons, but he didn't say what exactly. Cheng Hai smiled and said that he understood and asked where adventurers whose level is lower than 10th get these coins, adding that he also needs a little. He replied that he could try to sell some of the dropped items and asked if he had anything to sell. He added that he could take him to the local ghost market. The main character happily replied that there was, and thanked Zhu Mao, a city street with lots of signs, full of people. Zhu Mao and Cheng Hai walked down the street. Zhu Mao says that the ghost market is open from 2 to 4 in the morning every Monday, and that there are a lot of people here, but the share of adventurers is 1/10, if not less. He explained that sellers here often sell fakes, taking advantage of the fact that those who are not adventurers can easily be deceived. They looked at the jars of liquids that looked like potions. Cheng Hai smiled awkwardly and said that this place was a bit like an antique market. Zhu Mao chuckled and agreed. As he left, Zhu Mao raised his hand in a parting gesture and told the protagonist not to rush to sell everything at once, but to walk around and ask prices first and then make deals. He explained that he had some business to attend to, so he wasn't going with him. Cheng Hai agreed. He scratched the back of his head as he watched him go. With a slight smile, he said that he thought he wasn't a bad guy. Then, he decided that he needed to hurry up. He glanced at the man with earrings who was selling the loot from the kobold mine, bones for 2 yuan, skulls for 5 yuan, and bone fragments for 1 yuan. Looking in the other direction, he saw a display of swords that read, "Top quality products, only today prices are reduced." A plump man was loudly announcing his wares, arms spread wide. Looking in the other direction again, he saw someone selling stones. Then he noticed a man in a cap sitting on a newspaper with a purchase sign in front of him. The man was wearing a gray jacket, gray pants and a blue cap, and had a beard on his face. His head was tilted down, making it impossible to see his face. On the paper in front of him was written, "Buy. Preference is given to items from low-level dungeons with female subjects that can attract their attention and cause damage to them." Cheng Hai, reading the inscription, thought that according to the description, he intended to go to the Banshee Forest. The man asked if he had what he needed. Cheng Hai thought about the fact that he had a banshee summoning harmonica and a special sword that was oiled. The main character folded his arms, replied that there was, and asked what price he was willing to pay. The man smiled broadly, raised his head to look at Cheng Hai, reached out to adjust the visor of his cap, and asked for a look, and then he would tell him the price. Cheng Hai turned around and indifferently said that he would go home to get the goods and come back in half an hour, and told him to wait for him here. The man replied that he should hurry up, because if he received other offers during this time, he would accept them. The main character replied that he understood. Cheng Hai gave the man a harmonica and a sword. I look at the harmonica, and the man says it really can attract a banshee, and he's willing to give me 6 gold coins for it. The main character smiled happily. The man stared thoughtfully at the sword. Cheng Hai held up his index finger and smiled, explaining that this sword has a sacred attribute that gives +2 damage to evil creatures, and it is effective against the banshee's immunity to physical damage. The man said it was interesting. He offered to give him 8 gold coins for the sword and showed him the phone screen. The man told him to add him as a friend so that in the future it would be easier to conduct transactions. Smiling broadly and looking at his phone, Cheng Hai agreed. The payment confirmation came on the screen, and Cheng Hai left, looking at the bag of coins with a smile. The man waved after him, wishing him luck with a smile. The man continues to stare after him and then smiles ominously. This man was a level 7 adventurer, Gao Chengyun, a wanted a rank criminal. He said he forgot to take precautions and the cemetery was cleared. Park Day. His wristwatch says 10 hours and 57 minutes, and the guy asks that it's been more than an hour, and the guy called Phil not home. Deciding that he wouldn't wait for him, the guy wearing a blue sweatshirt clapped his hands and greeted the audience, introducing himself as Xiao Zai, the owner of the 5th level Dungeon Goblin Crypt. Pointed to the left and said that on his left was Miss Lin, an adventurer from the association, and explained that she was mentioned on the official website, so they shouldn't worry about vultures. Lin was standing with her hand raised at face level, dressed in a business suit. She has black hair pulled back in a thin, long ponytail. A man in a black t-shirt, vest, and white forehead patch asked if she had been dipped in ink. Xiao Zai pointed at the 3 men and said that it wasn't their first time joining him, and they were veterans with strong personalities. Behind the man in the blindfold was a man in a white sweater and a plump man in a blue jacket. A plump man with graying hair and a well-groomed mustache, dressed in a gray suit with a red tie, waved with a big smile and greeted the audience. He introduced himself as Wang, the operator of Dongshan Real Estate. Xiao Zai pointed at him and said that he was the sponsor of their operation, and that he was just an ordinary person. Then he pointed at Cheng Hai, who was smiling awkwardly and raising his hand in greeting, and a girl in a pink sweatshirt that covered the lower part of her face with a collar, with black straight hair, who was looking at her phone without paying attention to what was happening around her. He introduced them as new friends, a writer from Dongshan, and today I'm also lazy. Xiao Zai explained that their level is higher than the third and they are highly qualified. Still smiling, Cheng Hai strained his eyes in exasperation, thinking about why dungeon owners like to meet in the park so much and how it drives him crazy. Xiao Zai ran to the car and called for them to follow him with his hand, saying that since they had all familiarized themselves, they should follow him to the entrance of the Goblin Crypt dungeon. They followed him, and he said that the road was not close and offered to get water and something to eat. Gao Changyan, who turned out to be the person with the nickname Four Seas to Home, was looking out from behind a tree with a crazy smile, saying that he knew that Cheng Hai only sold items, but did not buy anything else and decided to use them to buy a ticket to a low-level dungeon. The car is coming down the road. Adventurers are walking through the forest. Wang asked Xiao Zai, wiping away the sweat on his face, how far they still had to go. Xiao Zai smiled, scratching his head, and replied that it wouldn't be long and the entrance was right ahead. The blindfolded man asked Xiao Zai how he found this entrance, noting that it was quite far away. Xiao Zai replied that it wasn't found by him, but by a local fool who sold it to him. The man asked if there were any fools these days who would trade the entrance to a dungeon for money instead of clearing it out. Lin glanced at the man in the blindfold. Behind them are Cheng Hai and the girl in the pink sweatshirt who was looking at the main character. Xiao Zai explained that since the crypt is really quite a difficult location for beginners, and the guy who discovered the entrance was the only survivor of those who tried to clear it, and since there are adventurers, it's much easier to just sell this entrance instead of using it yourself with no experience. He said that part of the money from the deal was given to the families of his fallen comrades, and suggested that this was reasonable. The man in the blindfold rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said that it was reasonable, but he didn't think that the guy really just sold him this dungeon. The men in the white sweater and blue jacket nodded their heads in silence. Xiao Zai furiously turned to the blindfolded man and asked that he still doubted him even though it wasn't the first time they had cooperated. Lin noticed the green entrance to the dungeon and announced that they were here. She opened the book signed as a dungeon guide and looked at the entrance to the dungeon, saying that the shape, color, and size of this entrance completely matched the entrance to a level 5 forest or crypt. She closed the book. She told the adventurers that they could enter after they assessed the risks. The blindfolded man happily shook his fist in the air. Xiao Zai said that he would personally vouch for everything. They started entering the dungeon one by one. Xiao Zai stopped Cheng Hai and the girl in the pink sweatshirt by blocking their path with his hand. Turning his head to them, he said that he had double-checked it and everything should be fine. He said that their father would protect Mr. Wang and asked if they had any objections, adding that the cheapness of the tickets for the two of them was due to him. Vaughn scratched the back of his head, smiling awkwardly as he patted his stomach, and said that he would share the meat with them. Cheng Hai and the girl were silent for a moment. The girl asked what about the exit. She said that the main task is the same for everyone, but her mission is to escape. Xiao Zai raised an eyebrow and smirked, saying that they would prioritize completing her mission and then deal with the rest. She said that then she would have no objections to entering the dungeon, and the reward from the main mission would be enough for her. The main character said that he has too. Cheng Hai came out on the other side of the passageway in the forest, where the adventurers were already looking into their adventurer panels. The man with the blindfold asked the men in the jacket and sweater what their mission was, to which they replied that their mission was to kill 2 goblins. The man in the blindfold replied that it seems that everyone has the same type of task, the only difference is in the number. Xiao Zai explained to Wang as he pointed at the adventurers panel that the missions in this dungeon are given out based on the level, and in short, the main mission is to find the Goblin Crypt. He explained that adventurers of 2-3 levels should discover it, and 4-5 levels to kill a certain number of goblins. Van replied that he understood, and added, looking at the girl in the pink sweatshirt who gave him a questioning look in return, that it wasn't surprising that his missions were different from hers. Xiao Zai clapped his hands and asked everyone to listen. He smilingly told them that since the newbies would be protecting Mr. Wang when they encountered the goblins, let them complete their missions first. Lin and the men from the blindfolded man's company agreed, and Xiao Zai announced that they could move out. Cheng Hai stared at the adventurers panel in surprise. The dialogue box says, challenge fight goblin warriors. Exit conditions, participate in killing goblin warriors. 2 hours later, the goblin's foot crushes the stone, purple blood spurting from its mouth. A man in a blindfold pressing a goblin into a rock asked the protagonist if he wanted to. Cheng Hai smiled awkwardly and declined. A man in a white sweater was sitting on a goblin, and a man in a jacket was smoking standing up. Vaughn, wiping his sweat with a handkerchief, asked if these were the level 5 dungeon monsters, saying that they didn't seem all that strong. Lighting a cigarette in his mouth, the man in the blindfold explained that this was because these goblins were ordinary mobs, and the most difficult bosses were probably hidden in the depths of the crypt. He turned to him with a lit cigarette and said that it usually takes 3 to 5 veterans to defeat the boss in the crypt, and normal goblins aren't a problem for them as long as their numbers don't exceed the limit. Van smiled, eyes wide, and said he understood. He said they could handle it if there were only a couple of goblins in the crypt. Xiaozai replied that of course they could handle it, but as far as they knew, the number of goblin warriors didn't exceed 1 per crypt. Somewhere in the forest there is a cave, inside which it is dark. Xiaozai said that there was only one known case of running into twin goblins, but he doubted that it would happen again. Wang chuckled and said that he was calm then. Inside the cave, you can see a large goblin with huge fangs and gold earrings. This is a goblin warrior, challenge level 5. Behind him is an unknown figure with eyes glowing red, and the only thing known about this figure is that its challenge level is 5. A crowd of goblins armed with swords and clubs rush to attack. A man in a blindfold, armed with a long-handled mace, which he holds in both hands, urged not to let the goblins escape. The man in the jacket was standing in a fighting stance, armed with brass knuckles. The man in the white sweater and the man in the jacket agreed and charged. Lin said it was bad, and Xiaozai looked at her questioningly. He asked her what she was talking about. She replied that since they had entered the crypt, they had already encountered 4 waves of goblins, and they were all very simple warriors, but they had not gone deep inside, and there were abnormally many mobs in this dungeon. The men successfully fight the goblins attacking them. Lin said tensely that they might have hit the jackpot. The girl in the pink sweatshirt asked Wang, who was wiping his face with a handkerchief, why he was so desperate to become an adventurer when he had so much money. She said that if he didn't want to miss the opportunity to enter the dungeons, he could just become a sponsor for a couple of adventurers. Vaughn smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, saying that he was ashamed to admit, but mostly he wanted to become an adventurer to lose weight. The girl was shocked by this response. Raising an eyebrow, she asked what the connection was between losing weight and all these risks. Wang's eyes flashed and he clenched his fists in front of him, explaining that he had interviewed a couple of people he knew in the profession, and they all said that meditation practices didn't require any physical effort, but also helped you become stronger and leaner. He asked her if she didn't think that adventurer meditation training was the perfect weight loss option for those who had a lot of money and no time for exercise. The girl's face turned blue from shock and, looking away, she noted that he spends so much money just to lose weight and said that they, the rich, are really difficult to understand. Cheng Hai appeared behind them and asked what they were talking about. He smiled awkwardly in his mail shirt and asked if he could go with them. Vaughn's eyes twinkled, and when he noticed that the man had prepared a chainmail suit, he said that he really was a true professional. He gave a thumbs-up gesture of approval. The girl was surprised to ask the main character if he dressed up like this every time he went down to the dungeon. Stretching his arms, Oni replied that he would have just died in the dungeon last time without the chainmail, and he didn't understand why she wasn't wearing armor. She said nothing. The impact of the weapon drew blood from the goblin's wound on the ground. Wiping the sweat from his brow, the man in the blindfold announced that they were done. There were many goblin corpses in front of them. He turned to Lin and Xiaozai and said that it was time to change, and the next wave of goblins would be upon them. Xiaozai smiled as he flexed his fists and said that it was their turn now. Cheng Hai asked in shock about the scoring mechanism. The girl looked down at him and asked if he didn't know that the less power he used in the dungeon, the more points he would get for completing the task. He stared back intently, wondering if that was true. With a disappointed hand on her face, she said that it wasn't surprising that he didn't need to kill small mobs this time, since he was clearing a dungeon in full armor back then. She said that she was afraid that his ranks, equipment, and skills weren't enough, and considering that most of what he had was basic level, he was no better than a beginner. Smiling nervously, Cheng Hai tried to say something, but the girl ignored him. Turning to him, she said that it was sad and that she knew it wasn't worth expecting much, but she didn't expect it to be so bad. She concluded that they had not one, but 2 newcomers in need of protection. The man in the blindfold interrupted their conversation and said they would chat later. He beckoned to them with a wave of his hand and told them that the goblin squad that had blocked their path had been destroyed and they could move on. The main character was happy and went ahead. 10 minutes later, they were in front of 3 tunnels. Xiaozai asked why there were 3 forks here, and shouldn't there be 2 in a 5th level bridge. Lin said that it seems that her previous fears were correct and they encountered a bug. She explained that this information about dungeons is not yet publicly available, and on average, in 1 out of 50 low-level dungeons, there is a moment when the actual difficulty exceeds or greatly exceeds the stated one. She explained that this is a bug. She said that there are 3 possible bugs. The first one is to increase the number of mobs. The second is to increase the number of bosses. The third is to increase the boss's strength. She held up 3 fingers and said that what they were facing was more like the first option. Cheng Hai held his chin and raised an eyebrow thoughtfully, thinking that if her words were to be believed, then the problems he had encountered in the past dungeons Vaughn anxiously asked Lin about the fact that if they went any further, they would run the risk of running into even more mobs. She replied that it was true. Vaughn held up his palms and smiled awkwardly, noting that it was dangerous, and suggested that he forget about it and just go back, adding that he wanted to become an adventurer. Zai shouted that he couldn't go back. Smiling and spreading his arms, he said that the number of mobs had exceeded everyone's expectations, but the boss's strength was probably still the same, and their task was not to kill all the goblins in the crypt. He said that they would just find the boss, kill them before the small goblins noticed them, and that it was no different from a normal mission. The man in the blindfold looked at him thoughtfully. Vaughn opened his mouth in surprise, and the girl raised an eyebrow. The girl frowned and said that the boss' strength hadn't changed, just in his imagination, and if he was wrong, it wouldn't be possible to deal with him quickly. She added that if mob reinforcements arrived at this point, they would all die here. Zai asked in displeasure if she was suggesting that we just give up and miss out on the opportunity to pass the dungeon. He told her that if she wasn't ready to take that risk, she should change her occupation and become a courier of some sort. The girl responded furiously, asking if the risk was too great, and said that challenging a dungeon that has a higher difficulty level than stated and that there is no clear information about is called suicide. The man in the blindfold asked if he could ask a question, and Lin turned to him. He asked if the reward for a bug dungeon was higher than for a normal one. She replied that it all depends on how much the actual complexity differs from the stated one. Lin said that it was rumored that even level 14-15 adventurers were sometimes willing to clear out such dungeons. To Zai's eyes and the girl's bewilderment, a hand was raised and Shanghai asked why not. Smiling awkwardly, he suggested that they just vote on whether to stay or come back. After a moment's thought, the man in the blindfold replied that it was a good idea and offered to vote. Zai irritably shouted at the girl to leave, and no one was keeping her here. The girl was angry. Raising his hand, Lin said to raise your hand to those who want to stay. The man in the blindfold, the man in the jacket, and the man in the sweater all raised their hands. Zai raised his hand. Vaughn stood awkwardly still, not raising his hand. The girl waved her head, hands in her pocket, thinking that they were a team of fools without any risk assessment. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open and she glared furiously away, pointing her finger at the main character, who raised his hand with a ridiculous smile and shouted where he was going. She said those guys were at least level enough to fight and she could understand them, but his strength was no good, so she asked him what he was up to. He said he wanted to try. Zai smiled and told Wang that since everyone had made their choice, it was time to say goodbye, and said that he would return the money to Wang later. Wang shook his hand and declined, saying that he was happy to cooperate. The girl called out to Wang, who turned around in surprise. He ran after her, asking her to wait. The others turned to watch them go.